Okay, in this lesson, we are going to be diving into talking about the impact of ADHD on specifically sex and intimacy. So I think the majority of us now have a pretty clear understanding or an awareness around how ADHD impacts us personally and how it impacts our relationship. I always tell the story that, when Barry and I first started dating, it started with me telling him about how ADHD impacts me. Then we very quickly realized, hang on a minute, this also impacts our relationship. But for a really long time, for some reason, we just didn't put two and two together that ADHD is also and was also impacting our sex and intimacy. And I think that this is one of those moments that so many people have a bit of an aha moment, because they kind of go, wow, I didn't realize that the hyperfocus, the sensory overload, the rejection sensitivity, the emotional dysregulation, all of that still also impacts and plays a role in sex and intimacy. So in this lesson, we're going to dive into the challenges specifically that individuals with ADHD face, so that you, as the ADHD person, and your non-ADHD or your partner, can really understand what's going on for the ADHD person and how ADHD is going to actually impact and affect your sex and intimacy. So let's dive into it. So one of the ways that ADHD impacts our sex and intimacy is through causing a lack of connection. So because ADHD is struggle with inattentiveness, we struggle with hyperfocus, impulsivity, and forgetfulness, it really can cause this lack of connection, right? It creates a divide between, or a separation between us and our partner. So I'm going to get into that a little bit more. So when you think of being inattentive, right, that can be, struggling to maintain focus, maintain attention. This can be in day-to-day interactions. So if your partner's trying to tell them about, tell you about their day and you are not really present, you're not really engaged, it can create this disconnect. Similarly, so that can really cause disconnect when it comes to intimacy, right? Or having that intimate connection with one another. Then when you take it that step further, during the actual deed, during sex, we could similarly, I've even experienced this, there's people I've talked to before about this, where, you can be more interested in what you're having for dinner that night, or what's on the TV at the time. You just have this difficulty to be present, and sometimes, that can cause this disconnect, because obviously your partner can sense when you are not kind of paying attention or involved in the same thing. So it causes this emotional distance, right? Then we've also got hyperfocus. So this is something that Barry and I, experience a lot. So because I'm such a hobbies gal, and I'm also very much a business oriented person. So I can get really hyper focused on work, which can then lead me to staying in the office till 10 o'clock midnight, and he's upstairs getting ready to go to bed, or is often fallen asleep. So we actually have this disconnect sometimes because of my hyper focus. Similarly, I might be he might be wanting to chat to me about something, and I'm hyper focused on one topic, and all I'm wanting to do is talk about that one thing. So it can really cause this lack of connection, or this lack of intimate quality time, because if you're not spending quality time with somebody, it's really hard to kind of establish this this bond that we need and develop that intimacy to then lead to sex. Again, impulsivity is another one. So lack of connection. Let's say you are having a conversation with your partner. They're telling you about how they feel, how much they love you, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, do you know what? I actually need to go buy that. Or, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry. And you get up and you bounce and you jump up around, or it's you interrupt them, or, something comes to your head and then you start talking about that. This can cause this lack of connection, right? Again, similarly with forgetfulness. So constantly, being forgetful and, not remembering important dates, or not remembering promises that you made. And this can often lead your partner, like we've talked about before, feeling this sense of, neglect, or they've been forgotten about, which causes, again, this lack of connection. And when we don't have connection with our partner, it's really hard to then have intimate moments and then have sex. Another way that ADHD impacts sex and intimacy is through lack of confidence due to rejection sensitivity. So this is something we talked about earlier, but rejection sensitivity is a really common issue for people with ADHD, like we've said. And basically what it is it's us being highly sensitive to perceived criticism or rejection. So rejection sensitivity in the context of intimacy. So this sensitivity can lead to anxiety about sexual performance or fear of disappointing their partner. So similarly, just as much as we have rejection sensitivity in everyday situations, this also applies to sex and intimacy with our partner. So a prime example of this is kind of like, let's say, I was to go shopping, I was to buy some lingerie, and then I was to come back to the house and I would really want, I was excited about it. And then I kind of went to put it on and I was like, it was a pink. And then I showed Barry and he was like, that pink, you should get that in blue. Or, you should get something like that in black. Or I really like black lingerie. I might perceive that as he doesn't like the pink. I don't look good in this. He doesn't like it. This was a whole failure. So it's like this rejection sensitivity that we've talked about earlier is it's like now we're experiencing it, but in the context of sex and intimacy. So it's important to understand that sometimes people with ADHD have this lack of confidence due to this rejection sensitivity. And again, that can play into sexual rejection. So the ADHD partner may perceive rejection from the partner more frequently. So, during intercourse or during, for example, if you were to be doing a certain movement or a certain position, or you might suggest one and your partner goes, oh no, I'm not into that, or, oh, that doesn't really feel good, you may perceive this sense of rejection. And because of our emotional dysregulation, we may take that really, really intensely. Performance anxiety. The fear of being judged or rejected can lead to performance anxiety. So because we've got this intense rejection sensitivity in our brain, we've got this sexual rejection sensitivity, we've got a lack of confidence, that's going to lead to performance anxiety, which is then going to create anxiety around actually having sex, which is going to cause a disconnect. And then this creates what's called a negative feedback loop. So the lack of confidence mixed in with the fear of rejection creates a negative feedback loop where basically the ADHD partner can often avoid having sex or initiating intimacy because they want to protect themselves from emotional pain. So obviously it is our brain's literal design to protect us from discomfort. So let's say, I'm constantly feeling this sense of rejection, even if it's not real, because that's what rejection sensitivity is. It's a perception of rejection. It's not actual rejection. So your partner isn't actually rejecting you, but ADHDers have this sensitivity to it where they perceive that they're being rejected. So it's not real. We're not saying that you are actually rejecting us. It's just simply we're perceiving that that's happening. So it's causing this lack of confidence, and we're kind of in this feedback loop where it's like we can't seem to get the confidence and the, surety to actually have intercourse. Another way, as we've discussed, trouble paying attention during intimacy. So this, like we've discussed before, this can lead to a lack of concentration, but this is also just a big thing in and of itself. So during sex, cuddling, or foreplay, people with ADHD may find their minds wandering or becoming easily distracted. Like I said, how many times are we thinking about the grocery list? How many times are we watching TV in the background? How many times are we thinking about that random fact that we learned that we want to share with our partner, but we know it's probably not the best time? This lack of focus can, without us realizing, convey disinterest to our partner, which then leads to misunderstandings and, like we mentioned before, strained connections. Another thing that people with ADHD experience is libido variations, and this is what is not talked about enough. So ADHD can significantly influence an individual's libido, resulting in high sex drives and low sex drives. And it's kind of this thing where you don't know what you're gonna get. So some people with ADHD experience this really heightened sexual desire where they frequently think about it, and then other people have the opposite. They have the low kind of libido, which is a decrease in it. So the change in libido can be due to a few different things, as we've kind of mentioned before, but when you think about libido, it's the desire for sex. So what gets in the way of that desire? So again, like we mentioned before, hyperfocus, mental fatigue. So when someone's in ADHD burnout or ADHD overwhelm, their libido is going to be less likely, it's going to decrease. Emotional distress, like we mentioned, rejection sensitivity, relationship stress and conflict, and then other coexisting conditions. So libido is a massive thing within ADHD. And it's also really important to understand that these fluctuations in libido within individuals with ADHD don't just present challenges for the ADHD partner, but they also present challenges for the non-ADHD partner. For example, if I have an incredibly high sex drive sometimes and Barry's matches that, we're good to go, right? His is usually pretty stable, his sex drive. So if it's really high, then we're good to go. If, for example, my sex drive, which it has, decreases, plummets, I'm not interested, I literally forget about sex, forget about him, it's gone, it's out of my brain. His sex drive's still high and mine's like down here. So as you can see, that would cause a significant, and it causes a significant issue. So it's something that we really need to be conscious of, which we will get to in the next lesson. So another thing that people with ADHD struggle with when it comes to sex and intimacy is sensory issues. So there are so many sensations that go on when you are having sex and intimacy, as you can probably relate. There's sounds, there's noises, I know they're the same thing, but there's feelings, there's temperature, there's so many different senses. All your senses are going. And for someone with ADHD, that can cause overstimulation, which when you are overstimulated, it's really hard to be present because you're focusing on what you can feel and what's irritating you or what's too much, rather than what actually feels good. So, sensory processing difficulties may lead to decreased tolerance for certain sensations or an increased need for sensory stimulation. So basically what this means is that like certain feelings may not actually feel as intense for someone with ADHD, and then on the other hand, some feelings may feel really, really intense. So a perfect example of this is Barry has this thing where he loves, like if we're on the couch, he'll just like kind of just nicely try to show affection by like patting or stroking my arm, whatever you want to call it. When he rubs it in the same spot over and over and over and over again, I literally want to scream at him. And I will tap his hand and I'll be like, Baz, stop touching me. And it's to the point that it's like so infuriating, like it just makes me so angry. So he has learnt that, repetitive movements, it has to either be firm or it has to be really soft. And we've talked about that, but it's important to kind of understand these things. So the reason we're talking about this is that, this can really impact sexual compatibility, right? So, and sexual satisfaction. So your partner might have experiences and they might think that they're doing a good job, and really for you, there is nothing more irritating, right? So that is one really big thing in terms of sensory issues, whether that's the breath, whether that's the moaning or the noises. Like, it's just really important to understand that if you have a partner with ADHD, as the ADHD partner as well, is that being aware that, if you are finding this disinterest in sex, sometimes it's because, our brain is trying to avoid sex because every time we have sex, there's these constant sensory overload situations that kind of happen. So it's really important to be conscious of that. Another way that ADHD impacts sex and intimacy is a lot of people with ADHD have a desire for risky sexual behaviors. And what do we mean by that? Basically, because people with ADHD often have a lower levels of certain neurotransmitters which contribute to impulsive behavior, because we are more impulsive, we have a greater likelihood for risk taking. So, in day-to-day life, that can be impulse spending, that can be a lot of different things like that. When it comes to sex, it can be impulsive things when it comes to sex, or risk taking when it comes to sex. So This may lead to a desire, for things such as unprotected sex, when you're like being impulsive and you're like, you should put a condom on or you should be using protection, and then you're like, nah, let's just go for it, even though you're going to regret if that's the situation, or you're not after that. You may even pursue activities that may not be safe or healthy. I know that a lot of people with ADHD even potentially consider things like open relationships and, different things like that, where when they're in the moment, they have that urge, but then they act on it and it ends up being not what they're after down the line. So it's just really important to understand that you've got this desire for riskier, more impulsive kind of things, but it's just one of those things that we've kind of got to be aware of. So those are most of the different ways that ADHD can impact sex, and in the next lesson we're going to talk about some strategies on how to manage those things. So we will see you in the next lesson.